Praise the Lord and welcome to the fourth and second last sermon in a series during our celebration of Ravi Zacharias Tribute Week at Praise Bible Church. The founder of RZIM and Zacharias Institute has gone to be with the Lord on May 19th. My wife Nunal was talking to Daniel Gilman from RZIM in Toronto, and she said to Daniel that world would not be same without Ravi. Daniel responded, world is not same because of Ravi. I want to tell you, God has called each one to be holy as our Heavenly Father is holy. But in our Christian walk, there comes roadblocks, what we call temptations. And there is no time in our walk that we do not battle temptation. And when we are in that battle, we feel that why do we have to go through this? Bible teaches that we are not alone victim or subject to temptation. We have someone in heavenly courts who understands. Hebrews 4:15 says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. For we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Watch as Ravi Zacharias powerfully ministers about battle of temptation.
Now, you're going to have to listen to this carefully. It's a nice, funny story. It's the story of a young would-be ordinand who was going to be interviewed by the bishop to see if he would qualify for the ministry. So the bishop looked at him and said this. He said, well, Sam, will you tell me the parable of the Good Samaritan? Yes, sir, I will, sir. Once there was this man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked him. And as he went on, he didn't have any money, and so he met the Queen of Sheba, and she gave him 1,000 talents of gold and 100 changes of raiment. And he got into a chariot and drove furiously, and when he was driving under that big juniper tree, his hair got caught on the limb of that tree, and he hung there many days and many nights, and the ravens brought him food to eat and water to drink. And he ate 5,000 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. One night when he was hanging there asleep, his wife Delilah come along and cut off his hair. And he dropped and fell on stony ground, but he got up and went on, and it began to rain, and it rained 40 days and 40 nights. And he hid himself in a cave and lived on locusts and wild honey. Then he went on till he met a servant who said, come take supper at my house. And he made excuse and said, no, I won't. I've married a wife and I can't go. And the servant went out in the highways and in the hedges and compelled him to come in. After supper, he went on and come on down to Jericho. And when he got there, he looked up and saw that old Queen Jezebel sitting way up high in a window. And she laughed at him and he said, throw her down out there. And they threw her down. And he said, throw her down again. And they threw her down 70 times 7. And of the fragments that remained, they picked up 12 baskets full beside women and children. And they said, blessed are the peacemakers, P-I-E-C-E. Now, whose wife do you think she will be on that judgment day? You know what? You really have to know the scriptures to get the gist of that story. But it is one messed up story. It's a story that's taken from bits and fragments of here and there and everywhere to make a marvelous story, but it is not the real story. It's a story made up by some guy trying to get an ordination, having missed the scriptures completely. I will suggest to you that maybe 5 or 10 years from now, if I read that in an average congregation, many might not even get it, because you have to know the real story in order to get the perversion of it. And the biblical narrative is very clear in the stories that it tells. The story I want to tell you today is a story that was witnessed to no human eye. It was only witnessed by Jesus himself, where he was in this parenthetical period between his baptism and the descent of the Spirit till he was commissioned on and moved into ministry. So we call it the temptation of Christ. The word temptation may not be the best one to use here. In the Greek, they actually have 2 different words for temptation. It might even be better to use the word that they often translate the testing of Christ, because just before he goes into the ministry, the devil, of course, comes into your life and mine with the hope to have us fall. But when the Lord takes us into a situation such as that, the real hope is that we would stand as He gives us the strength to resist and not to yield to what it is that the enemy of our souls is putting our way. Some years ago, I was stepping into an elevator in a hotel, and I had my Bible in my arm. Several businessmen got into the elevator, and one of them must have seen the Bible in my hand, and he said to me, "Are you a preacher?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to go and speak at a nearby play auditorium." He said, "What are you speaking on?" I said, "The problem of pleasure." He said, "I didn't know that was a problem." I said, "That tells you how deep a problem it is." No one has ever told me that temptation isn't a problem. Everyone knows that. We're all tempted. We all come to those crossroad moments. And here is that extraordinary narrative. It is told to us in Luke and Matthew. They both tell us that story in chapter 4, Matthew chapter 4 or Luke chapter 4. And somehow I feel the tail end of this message actually connects to God, the Gospel of John, the 4th chapter of John. So there are 3 4s, if you can remember. I'm going to read to you from Matthew, refer at the closing moments of this message to the Gospel of John and what it is that I think that has to say to us in this particular narrative. So if you've got your Bibles, Matthew chapter 4, reading from verse 1. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Please notice Jesus' answer. "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." So the tempter places the temptation. Jesus responds with the scripture. Notice what the tempter does now. Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand up on the highest point of the temple. "If you're the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down." The preamble is the same. If you're the Son of God, if you're the Son of God. But notice how he sustains the second temptation. "For it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." So I pause there. In the first instance, he places a temptation. Jesus refers to a text. The tempter comes back and refers to another text in order to position the second temptation. Jesus takes that text and puts it into a context. Because a text without a context leads to a pretext and can almost get you to do anything you want to do. Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and the angels came and attended him. I want to point out 2 or 3 important footnotes to this text and the context. All of the responses that Jesus makes to Satan in these 3 temptations, all of them come from one chapter in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy is often referred to as the favored book of Jesus. And if the proliferation of quotations somehow is an indication of a favored status, then Deuteronomy chapter 8 certainly must have been one of his most favorite chapters to refer to all of them in this immense testing moment. Now, the fascinating thing about this is while one of the gospel writers says that he left Jesus and went, another one says he left him for a season. This was not the last encounter they were going to have. He is going to come back again at a very critical moment in Jesus' ministry to try one more time to come in the way of God's answer to your predicament and mine in providing the way of redemption and giving us the answer of the cross. But I take this temptation saga very seriously, because you've experienced it either in one form or in all of the forms. The first temptation comes to the intellect. If Jesus had responded to the temptation of the intellect, it would have yielded to the philosophy of materialism. Materialism actually dictates that all that ultimately matters is matter. All that is essentially real in this world is matter and nothing more. Marxism is a materialistic fury. Naturalism, the scientific naturalists who want to do away with the spirit, end up ultimately with a materialistic universe. Only that which is tested and verified in a lab becomes that which is to be believed. The spiritual is marginalized and put away completely. But notice the temptation to the intellect. The temptation assumes this, that if Jesus would perform his magic trick for the individual, take these stones and turn it into bread, they will no longer be hungry. You will be the provider. Number one, they will be full, but more importantly, they will see that you can do anything you want to do. And when you do that, we will follow. They will all follow you. You will not lack for followers whatsoever. I don't believe that is true by any stretch of imagination. All you need to go is to the passages in the Old Testament through the wandering in the wilderness. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, they are reminded of this very thing, how time and again, in their most dire circumstances and their greatest need, God came through and provided for them. And yet when the crunch came after they came into the promised land, they jettisoned all that belief. Abraham Lincoln, in a very powerful talk on the proclamation of humiliation, warned America that the day could come where American people actually believed that all that had been accomplished by their own intellect, and they did not have to bow in gratitude to a living God who'd made it possible for all of them. The intellectual struggle is huge. Bertrand Russell was once asked why he didn't believe in God, and he said, "I just do not see enough evidence." Only a week ago at Princeton, a young 21-year-old man, eyeball to eyeball with me after we'd gone toe-to-toe in the open forum. When I asked him, I said, "What do you have against Jesus?" He said, "There's just not enough evidence." And I said to him, "All you're doing is quoting Bertrand Russell. I'm asking you, do you really believe there's not enough evidence?" And then we can go back and forth on this. The person who said to Bertrand Russell, "Why don't you believe?" And he said, "Because there's not enough evidence." The person said, "Do you think you're talking about the absence of evidence for you or the suppression of evidence by you?" I had a professor at graduate school who had 3 earned doctorates, had quite a weird sense of humor. He would come up with all kinds of stories every now and then, which was helpful because the stories we understood. Much else of what he said we often didn't understand. But in this story, he talks about this man who woke up one morning and looked at his wife and said, "I think I'm dead." And the wife said, "What do you mean you're dead? You're talking to me." He said, No, I really think I'm dead." And this, after a few weeks of this kind of stuff, you've really got to pass it on to the medical people, the men in the white coats, as it were. So she took him over to see some doctors, and the doctor, there were psychiatrists, and they were trying to establish for him that he was actually deluding himself with this. He was very much alive, but he wouldn't buy it. So then she took him to a team of doctors sitting there in their coats, and they were zeroing in on one thing. They were trying to prove to him just one stipulation: only living people bleed. Only living people bleed. Overhead charts, projectors, data, information, all this stuff to make him accept that only living people bleed. Finally, he looked at them and he said, all right, I guess there's enough evidence. Only living people bleed. As soon as he said that, one of the doctors put his hand into his pocket, took out that pin, plunged it into this man's veins. The blood came spurting out. He looked at it and said, "Great Scott, I guess dead people bleed too." It was many years ago. I remember doing an open forum at Princeton. I was back there again, as I said last week. Years ago, I was doing a forum. And they told me they were bringing out the heavyweights, philosophical heavyweights, who were going to take on the challenge of what I was going to talk in defense of Christianity and examining atheism. And at the end, so I was really, you get uptight about this. You're thinking who these heavyweights are, these boys or these women, highly knowledgeable in some discipline that I know nothing about. And at the end of my talk, we had about an hour of questions. There was no heavyweight question that I heard. So I finished it, and then next night I did the second forum, and one fellow stood up in the question and answer, and he said this to me. He said, last night we brought some of the heavyweights out here to challenge you, and not one of them stood up. And as we were walking back, I looked at one of them and said, what's the matter with you? You told me you wanted to come and take him on, and at the end of the talk, when he gave you that 1 hour focus, you boys didn't do it. Say anything. What happened? And he said, here's what they said to me. The arguments were too powerfully stated in order for us to really challenge them. But our minds have remained unchanged. So the man standing at his feet with a full auditorium said to me, what do you want me to say to them? I said, if they were listening, my opening line was, I will do my best to demonstrate for you today that your problem with God is not intellectual, it is moral. So that's all I have to say to them. You see, the intellectual side of it, you can keep debating from now till kingdom come. We talk about the theory of origins. We talk about the specified complexity of the way human life is, and sometimes comes under the genre of intelligent design. Nobody would ever convince you that a dictionary developed because of an explosion in a printing press. Why not? Not just because it's thick, not just because a lot of it makes sense, but the specificity and the complexity of the nature of language to take you from the beginning to the end shows to you that there is an intelligence behind it that needed to put that together. And that's only a handful of a few thousand words and 26 letters in the alphabet. In your DNA and mine, there's 3.1 billion bits of information. 3.1 billion bits. My professor of quantum physics at Cambridge University is a renowned physicist by the name of John Polkinghorne. He was actually the dean of Queen's College, Cambridge. Not a man high in stature, but brilliant, and his books have been acclaimed as the finest in the world of quantum physics. I'll never forget the one day he was giving a lecture on just one of the contingencies that had to be specific in the early picoseconds of the formation of the universe. Now, to most of us uninitiated in that terminology, let me explain what a picosecond is. A picosecond is so minute a fraction of time that it is actually given a name to be attached to that object which is traveling at the speed of light. How long will it take that object traveling at the speed of light to cross one single strand of hair? That's a picosecond. And if you got my problem, it wouldn't take very long to cross that. You know what? When we start talking like that, we're really bordering very near abstraction. Try to think of a picosecond. It has passed before you probably can even think about it. And he was looking out at a window and talking to us, and he says this. He said, about 30-some contingencies had to be so finely tuned and so precise, and the margin of error so small. And that day he was dealing with just one of those contingencies, the relation of the expansion to the contraction forces, how exact it had to be in the early picoseconds of the formation of the universe. And this was the analogy he gave us. He said, do you know how small the margin of error could be in that relation of expansion and contraction forces? He said it would be the equivalent of taking aim at a 1 square inch object at the other end of the known universe, 20 billion light years away, and hitting it bullseye. Amen. Just one of those. You take all the other laws that had to come into focus, the exactitude demanded of just the strong and the weak forces, and how precise it had to be. And in typical English understatement, he looked at us, he said, you know what? There's no free lunch. Somebody has to pay. I remember once teaming up at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, with a famed astronomer by the name of David Block. David Block put up a screen a slide of a screen. He is still very much active in the field of astronomy. He put up a slide on the screen and he said, "Do you know how many stars you're looking at right now? You're looking at 100 million of them in this picture." And we were at this vast university audience, and Block looked at them and he said, "I have a question for you. Do you know how long it would take you to count these if you took one per second?" He said, 2,500 years. See the immensity, the vastness, and the specificity. It is so finely tuned that, let me just quote two great skeptical scientists for you. One is Sir Frederick Hoyle, who was an astronomer at Cambridge, and his colleague was Chandra Wickramasinghe, who was at Cardiff. Wickramasinghe is from Sri Lanka, and Hoyle from Great Britain. And these two men did their studies on trying to establish the possibility of the world happening by accident. Neither of them is a Christian. And here's what Hoyle and Wickramasinghe came out with. When they were looking at the biochemical makeup of the body, they're not looking at anything else right now, just the biochemistry of the body and the enzymatic makeup. Here's what they concluded mathematically: the possibility of it happening was 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. That means 1 in 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. So you know what Frederick Hoyle said? It is mathematically impossible, considering the number of atoms in this universe, for this to actually happen randomly. So my conclusion is this, says Sir Frederick Hoyle, that spores from another planet were somehow brought into this one. I'm not kidding you. I'm not making this up. And they tell the Christian he or she lives by faith. And you know what? He's not the only one. The panspermia theory was actually spawned by pardon the pun, spawned by a European, I think a Swedish or a Polish physicist. And the other one who subscribed to it is Sir Francis Crick. Crick is one of the brightest minds ever. He was given the Nobel Prize for cracking the code of the DNA. And he said this: the formation of this world is almost a miracle. And so I yield to the panspermia theory that it could not have come from nothing, and non-consciousness could not have produced consciousness. And he took of all the impossibilities and said some spaceship or something brought spores from another world to seed the earth. You're telling me their problem is intellectual? Take a look at the practical side of it. We're living in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Now, I have no doubt there are spots in your part of this beautiful part of the world as there are where we live. There's poverty, there's deprivation, there's lack. We know that. It doesn't take long to drive around and see that. But the country from which I come, India, has more deprivation and more need than you can think of. It's a nation of over 1 billion and a lot of deprivation out there. If you have seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire, you'll see some of the tragic underbelly of that side of the reality. India is one of the most religious nations in the world. America is fast becoming one of the most pagan nations in the world. No school in India that I know of would object to me singing carols at Christmas time. But many schools in America that I know of would ban me from doing that. Explain that to me. We have all the bread that we want at the table of these sophisticated people who want to block us and take away from us the freedom to believe in the transcendent, personal, moral first cause, because they try to tell us it is intellectually incredible. Jesus said, you know what? That's not the problem. It is written that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. One of my favorite authors of all time was the author Malcolm Muggeridge, I believe the greatest journalist of the 20th century. One of the great thrills of my life was to have an afternoon with him and his wife Kitty in Cambridge years ago. I'll never forget it. Every now and then I pick up the one book that he signed for me, one of his own books. He was quite hunched over, almost a gargoyle-like appearance, you know. He was so brilliant in the use of language. If you have never met Muggeridge or never read Muggeridge, you've missed one of the best users of the English language of all time. And Muggeridge used to teach journalism in his younger days in India. He was a freewheeling liver, lived in the ways without any moral boundaries. By his own admission, he wrote a 2-volume autobiography of his journey to Christ. And one of them is called The Green Stick, The Chronicle of Wasted Years. That was volume 1. The second volume was called The Infernal Grove. And ultimately, he wrote Jesus Rediscovered. But in this first volume, The Green Stick, A Chronicles of Wasted Time, he tells the story of how he stepped out of his quarters one morning in India, in the south of India, and he went to the river to have his bath. And as he was soaking up the water, he saw in the distance the silhouetted figure of a woman who was herself getting into the waters to have her bath. Muggeridge, knowing no boundaries, decided he was going to try and see if he could seduce that woman. Here at dawn, he's swimming towards her, and in his own words, he said, "Deep inside my heart, I knew what I was doing was wrong, and the voice inside me saying, don't, but I swam harder to get closer to her." And of course, one can imagine the woman watching this happen, a village woman there, and not only seeing somebody coming towards her, but as he emerged from the water, she's a foreigner standing up, staring at her eyeball to eyeball. And Malcolm Muggeridge says, "As I emerged from the water and shook the water off, I was looking into the eyes of a woman who was a leper." He says, as she put her hands up to protect herself, those extremities were all worn out, the nose worn out, the eyes and all of that. He said, and as I stared at her, I didn't know how to react except to mutter to myself, "What a lecherous woman." And he said, and then it dawned on me, it was not the woman that was lecherous, it was my heart that was lecherous. And he began his own pursuit to find Christ, which he did later on in his life. And that was what all our conversation was about. You see, the greatest discovery in any human heart is to understand how God sees it. In fact, I told you Matthew 4 harks back to Deuteronomy 8. And in Deuteronomy 8, here's what we are told. I took you through this wandering in the wilderness. It ought not to have taken them more than 6 weeks, but it took them 40 years, he said, so that you would know what was in your heart. Amen. He wanted them to see how hostile you and I are, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. Even if you were to take the first two away, the pride and conceit factor, which is the ultimate resistor to the grace of God, is something that stalks all of us. We really want to do it our way. The intellectual appeal came to Jesus, and Jesus has begun. It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. C.S. Lewis put it in these words so brilliantly and so cogently. He said this, you do not have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. Amen. You do not have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. And if you are a soul, then the greatest need you really have is for God's word, which is true, to help you to understand what life is really all about and what brings ultimate purpose. Jesus gets to that in the third temptation. The second temptation comes to the will. The will is what? It is utilitarian. To make this, the number one would have yielded to materialism. Had he yielded to the second temptation, it would be utilitarianism. Now, I have to pause for a moment, because if you're a student of philosophy, you might want to take issue with that, because in a classical sense, utilitarianism is actually of the philosophers Bentham and Mill, where you have to weigh out in decisions societally what is the maximum number of good for the maximum number of people. That's the way utilitarianism philosophically designs itself. I'm using it more in a popular sense here of utilizing God, using him for your own purpose. Sort of utilizing spirituality, becoming religious because at that moment it will serve your purpose. Sort of like a slot machine, putting in the right coin or stating the right mantra. There's a bumper sticker that was doing the rounds in the 80s and in many parts of the US, which said on the back, as long as there are math tests, there will always be prayer in schools. It's true. You can't ban a student from praying when he's looking at a question paper in an exam and he knows he's going to flunk it. You better believe he's going to call out to God. In fact, I don't know how many of you know the name of Richard Dawkins. Do you know the name of Richard Dawkins, that very noted atheist, belligerent atheist? I want to tell you something fascinating that happened, and this is a true story. It happened a few months ago. He was on a radio program on the BBC live, and he was dialoguing with one of the ministers of St. Paul's Cathedral. And he was, as usual, but Dawkins just very belligerent and hostile and verbose and all that he does to criticize believers. And he said, Christians are basically very unintelligent people. He said, if you want to ask an average Christian even to name the Gospels, they won't know it. They don't know it. And so the vicar just kept listening, and he said, Richard, you're a very erudite scientist. And Richard's just nodding, He said, your favorite book is The Origin of Species, right, by Darwin? He said, right. He said, Richard, can you name the full title of the book? This happened live. And Dawkins said, oh, yeah, I know it's a much longer title than The Origin of Species. So the vicar said, go ahead. Name it for me. I'm quoting this to you now. Please forgive me. This is the way it went. Richard Dawkins says, The Origin of Species. Oh my God. The ultimate proof of the sovereignty and omnipotence of God is that it even takes an atheist who doesn't believe in him to call upon him to remind him of the title of the book that helped him deny him. And the next morning's newspaper said, and I quote, it's been a bad week for atheists. You see, the using of God, we use it either profanely or we actually use it in a very pragmatic sense. God, please help me with this exam today. God, please provide for this. God, please provide for that. I want to tell you something. If you got a miracle today, for something that you had been longing for and you got it, and you say, thank you, Lord. You walk out of here tomorrow and another tragedy strikes, you will want another miracle again, as will I. And what you end up doing is what Alexander Pope says, we've snatched from his hand the balance and the rod, we've rejudged his justice and become the God of God. We've snatched from his hand the balance and the rod. We've rejudged his justice and become the God of God. I told the audience in the earlier service, without going into details, I won't go into details again. I injured my back in the mid-'80s and suffered with a lot. 3 herniated discs, L3-4, L4-5, and then L2-3. And so in 2002, I was bracketed down in a major surgery, 2 titanium rods with 8 screws that just bolt me down. It gives me stability, it takes away any flexibility. And for years and years, you just hope some relief will come. And last year, a friend of mine from Singapore, long story, I won't go into the details, he said a prayer for me and something incredible happened. And for the first time in many, many years, I felt that relief taking place, that pain going away. And I was not able to sit down on a chair, cross my leg, and tie my shoelace. And after that, 2-3 days later, here I was doing it, go through security, and you sit down on a chair, cross your leg very, very boldly now. And you're proud that you can cross your leg, and tie your shoelace and so on. And I often think about it, and I say to myself, Lord, 27 years was a long time to be injured. Am I completely out of the woods? I don't know if I'm completely out of the woods, but I do know that what I lived with the inflexibility there, has so dramatically changed. I just say this to say to you all what I'm concluding more and more. God works his ways and works in his time. This is the thing we have a great deal of struggle with. We all want things right away. I want them right away. I want to see things happen instantly. I don't know what some of you are struggling with. It could be a great financial burden. It could be a broken or a hurting relationship. It could be the struggle physically that you're battling. It could be an alienation. It could be a job that's made you miserable and you desperately wish you could find something else. Being human is to go through the struggles of these issues. What was the famed preacher, Dr. Jowett once said, if you preach to a broken heart, you will never lack for an audience. Because many broken hearts. I don't know what you're struggling with, but I want to tell you, don't ever give up. Because God works in His time, in His way. And when He comes through, the older you get, the more you believe in the grand weaver. The younger you are, you want to weave it on your own. The older you get, the more you look back, there is no way I could have woven this fabric in my life. Never. Not one of my sisters, my sister was a pastor's wife in Toronto, one of our friends from our childhood days. We used to play cricket, used to play marbles, grew up together and so on. I was the loser of the bunch. I'm not kidding you. I was the loser. The day the examination results came, I would run away and hide because all the other ones were right at the top. I had to keep searching through the newspapers till I found my number. And this fellow, who's now a very highly placed man in Washington, he's from India. He was visiting my sister, and my sister is telling me this. He sat across the table and said, whatever happened to Ravi? How did all this turn out? I said, thanks a lot. She said, we all burst out laughing. He said, of all the group out there, I never thought anything would come of his life. He was right. Neither did I. Neither did my family. Neither did my parents. And that's what ultimately took me to a bed of suicide at the age of 17. When you lose hope, the only thing you want for is to not feel anymore. But look at the grand weaver. Look at the grand weaver. How he weaves a design, how he has a plan. And I can assure you, when you trust him, you depend on him, you lean on him, he will bring that design to pass in a way at the end of life you will say, it's all of him and almost nothing of me in here. And so he says this, you shall not test the Lord your God. What would have happened if Jesus had said, let me jump to see if he'll protect me? The tempter would not have had to come back again because he came back again to keep him from the ultimate leap, the leap onto the cross where he was going to be in such unbearable pain. In English, we use the word excruciating. It actually comes from two Latin words, excruciatus, which literally means out of the cross. Excruciating pain is analogous to the description of what the cross actually meant. That's why Roman citizens were barred from being crucified unless it was for treason. The barbarians invented it. The Greeks picked it up. The Romans inflicted it except on their own people. That's what the cross was all about. And how God in his mercy provided the cross for your redemption and mine, so that he took his son all the way to the place that he promised he would ultimately take him. And we see how in that sacrifice, our own soul's healing was ultimately provided. Many of you are familiar with an island not too far from here and its story, Kalaupapa in the island of Molokai. Years ago, my wife and I had the privilege of going there, and she doesn't know this, but between the two services, we've been offered to be taken there again while we are here on vacation, so I look forward to that. But when you go to Molokai, one of the most beautiful spots in the world's tallest sea cliffs, I think 12,000 feet or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember exactly. 8,000, 12,000. It's beautiful. And what happened there was all of the victims of leprosy were put away there. And you know, there's a book written by a young woman there called Olivia, now then in her older years. If you see the early pages and see her photograph, a beautiful young woman, as the pages go, you see what leprosy had done to her. And in one of those pages, she writes a letter to the actor Alan Alda. She said, my one pleasure in the evening is watching your program MASH. Said, I laugh, I enjoy it. She said, but Mr. Alda, something terrible happened in your show today that hurt me deeply. You walked into a dirty, filthy room and you made the comment, what do you think, this is a leper colony? She said, Mr. Alder, I have leprosy. I am not a leper. I am a person who has leprosy. Amen. The man who went there was Joseph Damien from Belgium. And he touched them, built a chapel for them, preached to them every day, until one day he poured a boiling kettle of water that fell on his bare foot, and he realized he didn't feel it. And it dawned on him he'd contracted leprosy. You know, while we were walking around, the gentleman showing us, I saw Damien's grave. I said, is Damien buried here? He said, no. I said, then why is the marker here? He said, they wanted to bury him here, but the Belgian people said he's one of our heroes. We want him back. And so the people finally negotiated. Some books say the arm, others say just the hand, that the hand was taken and buried there because the people wanted to keep the hand that touched them. That's why the hymn writer says, what language shall I borrow to thank you, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. The tempter came to him before the cross and said, if thou be the Christ, save thyself and us. Why don't you save yourself? No, you do not use God. Sometimes in and midst and through suffering and pain, God brings you to the place that He has prepared for you and chosen for you. Never a happy feeling, but it's a reality, and the cross reflects it more than anything else. Actually, Muggeridge said it is because of that the cross drew him to Christ, because he said, all the pleasures in the world never brought me the ultimate fulfillment as when I submitted my life to Jesus Christ and surrendered my ego and my will, and it was through the cross. So Satan comes first to the intellect, which would have yielded materialism. Then he comes to the will, which would have yielded utilitarianism. Now he comes to the imagination. When you cannot appeal to a person from the front door of reason, you have to go through the back door of the imagination. And in the back door of the imagination, havoc can be wreaked. Because you mess with a child's imagination, or you mess with a young person's imagination, everything can become inverted. Evil can become good. Good can become evil. All the definitions change. Why do you think the most powerful instrument or the weapon in the world today is the entertainment industry? Because they don't come to you through the front door of reason. They come through the back door of the imagination and mess the reason up completely. Mess it up completely. And the imagination is so sacred. You watch it in a little child's life. Just talk to a little child. Think of the things they ask about, things that they want to talk about. And the beauty of their imagination leaves you time and time again so spellbound and so beautifully fulfilled. But you notice the earlier days of fairy tales, those who wrote stories of the imagination, they were brilliant stories. Why? There was always a fairyland. You could ride on all kinds of wings. You could ride on a broomstick. You could do all these things. But there was always a condition. If you don't come back by such and such, you will become a such and such. You don't come back by 12, you're going to become a pumpkin. And G.K. Chesterton said, if you'd said to the fairy godmother, how come? The fairy godmother would probably have said to you, tell me how come there is a fairyland. You've already assumed the magic and the mystery of a world such as this. And when you assume and when you take the mystery of a world such as this, you have to have conditions. You have to have parameters. You have to have boundaries. The happiest person is not the one who lives with the freedom of illicit sexuality. That person is the most enslaved. Truly. In fact, the loneliest moment is when you have just experienced that which you thought would deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. It lets you down. I give you the classic example of Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde wrote the book, The Picture of Dorian Gray. It is almost, I think, autobiographical. Oscar Wilde lived with immense pleasure. Unbridled pleasure. The dandyism movement spawned by him, all of the colors which he had with flair and so on. He was brazen about his indulgence. almost reflected again by the French philosopher of recent times, Michel Foucault, who ended up dying of AIDS because he's the one who coined the phrase, live without boundaries. When Wilde is dying, he asks for a priest. Tell me why. Oscar Wilde asks for a verse to be put on his gravestone, which I have seen. He selected a verse from the book of Job, a book known for suffering. Some time ago, my colleague Matt, who travels with me, and I were in Australia. And there was I say this very truthfully, a handsome young man, well-built, solidly built, nice-looking guy. He had written to my assistant, Julie, who's here, I think, in the audience now, and said, can I see Ravi? Because his messages and all of that really rescued me from a horrendous life. And he told his story in that letter. So I agreed to see him. And here walks in this good-looking guy, and I'm sitting down in this the lounge of the hotel, and I said, how are you doing? And his opening answer to me was, lucky to be alive. I said, wow. I said, I don't often hear that. He said, well, you know my story, don't you? And the wheels started to turn, and I tried to remember all that he'd said. He worked, in his own words, as a male prostitute in Hollywood. He said, I could give you a list of my clients and tell you all that I did. He said, Ravi, I'd be out every night with the best of them. He said, I knew no boundaries. I'd go in either direction. Whoever wanted my services for the night, I went. He said, I finally contracted AIDS. And he is now sitting there across the table telling me, I'm just lucky to be alive. I said, how do you feel when you were going through all of this? He said, come back at 3 or 4 a.m. and I'd lie down in bed and I'd weep and say, what's happened to my mind? What am I doing to myself? He said, I had all the money I wanted. I was on the top 10 list as the model being paged by all of this. In an incredible story, he turns his life over to Jesus Christ. Dramatically transformed. A beautiful young Australian gal who is a pediatrician fell in love with him. They're married, they're building their home and their family together in Perth, Australia now. And as he shares his testimony, he tells the story. The whole path to pleasure was nothing short of a self-destructive lifestyle. Yes, you can have pleasure, but the pleasure that God intends for you is the pleasure within the sacred. It's a pleasure within the sacred that is inviolable. When you enjoy pleasure within the sacred, it is a perpetual novelty. When you desacralize pleasure, you end up with total emptiness. Hence the Foucaults, the Sartres, the Oscar Wildes, and so on. The life that never fulfilled. So what is it that Jesus ultimately says to him, as this whole thing comes to naught, what actually happens is the third temptation comes for the philosophy of hedonism. I'll give you all of the pleasures of this world if you will just bow down and worship me. And Jesus' answer is so simple, so simple. He takes 2 words, proskuneo and latreia in Greek. Proskuneo we transliterate to prostration. Latreia, we get the word for service. There are 4 words in the Greek for worship. Proskuneo, latreia, liturgia, from which we get liturgy, and homologia, meaning the same word, the amen side of life. He takes the first 2 most often used ones. He said, you shall prostrate yourself before the Lord your God alone, and him only shall you serve. Your hands and your head. You come with reverence and you come with service. The same words that Joshua uses to worship the Lord your God, and him only shall we serve. I tell you today, this temptation story leads to the purpose of what life is all about. Life is ultimately a relationship with God, and you either find it or you walk away from it, and you will never find meaning and purpose outside of it. Or you may have punctuated meanings, you will never have ultimate meaning. I want to close with a couple of applications here. The first is this. What does worship really mean? How do we come to terms with it? I like to give a very simple statement about it. It is the sense and the service of God. And it is coextensive with life. You don't just come here to worship. Your life itself is an expression of worship. But Archbishop William Temple had one of the most profound definitions, and I like it because it gets every angle well. He says this: worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It's the quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which you are capable. Do you notice how he pulls everything together? Emotions, will, imagination, heart, conscience, all of that. He is answering the ultimate question the Greeks raised. How do you find unity in diversity? We make the mistake of thinking we have to find it on the outside. We must, but we will never find it on the outside until we first found it on the inside. That's what worship does. And then I close. One of my favorite authors in the early days of my undergraduate studies was a man by the name of Arthur Leonard Griffith, who was one time minister at City Temple in London, then came to Toronto and pastored there at the famed St. Paul's Cathedral. And here's what he said in his book, God's Time and Ours, referring to the temptation of Christ. He says this: Satan tempts us at the point of our physical needs, not that we might gratify them to excess, but that we might think of nothing else and gratify them at the expense of our usefulness in this world. Satan tempts us at the point of our ambitions, not that we might engage in positive evil, but simply accept the fact of evil, learn to live with it, come to terms with it, and maintain a discreet silence in the presence of it. Satan tempts us at the point of our religion, not that we might disbelieve in God, but that we might demand certainty, that kind of certainty which leaves nothing at all to faith, nothing to God Himself. These are the moral struggles that have reality for people such as we are. The subtle temptation to renounce our duty in favor of what is attractive, that insidious allurement to a kind of half-goodness, which is the essence of everything bad, and which is more productive of suffering and hatred and war and misery in this world than all the designs of wicked and greedy men combined. Powerful statement, how Satan tempts you and me. And so as we close, and I give my thanks to my brother Waxer for having me here, I just say this to you: how are you doing with temptation? How are you battling it? Has it waylaid you? Are you living in that no person's land of half-hearted commitment? Or are you willing to say, I need the strength of God to be able to resist? In Romans 7, Paul says this: that which I want to do, I don't do. That which I end up doing, I detest. O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death? And then in chapter 8, he begins, thanks be to God, through the Spirit that lives within you, how He gives you that rescue. And so I'm going to give you an invitation that I gave the folks this morning as they responded. I'm going to ask you to pray with me. Just bow your heads in prayer and listen to the voice of God. If some of you are saying today, Ravi, I've battled temptation and I've not done well. I want God to help me. I want to renounce those private ways and make the change and have the Lord give me the strength that I really need to battle all of this. And today, I make that commitment. Or it may be that some of you are even willing to say, as some did this morning, Ravi, I've never known Christ, and I really want to know Him this morning. So if you're coming to Christ for the first time, or you're struggling in temptation and losing, and you want to make that turnaround, I'd like to pray for you. Please do this not because anybody else is doing it or is going to make somebody else happy. Do it because the Lord is prompting you in your heart that this is your moment. This is your time. I would love to pray for you. If you are responding to him this morning as he's calling upon you to either come to trust him for your salvation or to rescue you from this life of defeat, just put your hand up and I would love to pray for you as we close this meeting. Father, these hands have gone up, but you saw the heart before we could see the hand. I pray that those who are reaching out to you today will truly sense you responding to them, to clean up that inside of the life, tidy it up through your cleansing power so that you can make your home in there. I pray particularly for one who's living in constant defeat. Let today be the turnaround day for victory after victory after victory. And when the enemy of our souls comes to stalk them, let your power reign and defeat the one who is already defeated. I thank you for this church. I thank you for my brother Waxer and his entire team and his family, for those who labor hard to make this a place where your word is preached and lives are changed. Be with him even as in the times where he needs you most, to make him an instrument powerfully used and multiply that in this setting. I pray for the children I see here today, that you will watch over them in a time of troubled issues. Raise them up to be bright lights, and for the young, that they will be witnesses, light and salt. Lord, it's a world that's so grim and so out of control. Please use your people to provide a chart and a compass and a rudder, that we might steady this ship on the high seas of life and know what our harbor is and destination. Let your blessing rest upon us, and thank you for giving me the strength to do what you call me to do today in Jesus' name. Amen.